is is a view where you, again, peeling back and looking at sort of macro level events. A lot of, sorry, there's the whole issue of neoliberalism and right. Okay.
Sorry, I think we should be good now. You can control it again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's try to stay out of your way. All right. So anyway, so I've crossed out neoliberalism because I'm sort of ceasing to use this term, but let's just say the current variant of global capitalism, right? And hyper-mediatized times. So again, the times we live in, where we talk about things like the infosphere and sort of the information society we live in. So again, this is sort of the backdrop. And it's worth looking at this because one of the issues about NE that I noticed, as I said, when I started reading about it, was a kind of general acceptance that, you know, it is what it is, and it's something you just have to get on with and maybe look at making it as good as possible. And, you know, I'm more interested really in sort of the broader issues, what's behind it, if you like. So I'd like to just go through just a few things right now to sort of show that. Now, if we look at this current variant of global capitalism, we can use this acronym. I don't think that's going to take off as an acronym, but I just use it for today. We have this associated phenomenon. Many of you will be familiar with this, but this is sort of the traditional definition of neoliberalism again. And the other thing to bear in mind about all of these things going on is they're different in different contexts. So we're not talking about a monolithic sort of approach to global capitalism that in each individual context it would be different. Therefore, it's very different. Now, a lot has been written about the impact of global capitalism as it is today on higher education, and particularly in the Anglophone world. And I say that referring to countries like Australia, the United States, Britain. And here you have Stefan Collini, who's published a series of books about the state of universities, where he also offers a very interesting sort of defense of the humanities, disappearing in many parts. This is an interesting book from the US about consuming higher education. We have Henry Giroux, who's written several books in recent times. He's like the neoliberalism war on higher education. And my favorite is The Toxic University by John Smith. And this is an Australian scholar. This book was published in 2014, but obviously it's still relevant today. Now, what he talks about in this book, and this is kind of a compilation of what Smith talks about, also some information is gleaned from other sources. But this is kind of the state of higher education. So any of you who work in higher education will recognize immediately these elements. So the marketization that goes on, a bifurcated workforce, and really not just bifurcated, but if we're looking in terms of what we talk about researchers on this side and maybe teachers on this side, this sort of thing. So diversifying at least the workforce where you separate out teaching and research. Specialization comes with that, the specialization within research, individualism, competition, superstar academics, the attention economy, which I'll come back to at the end in a slightly different form. A lot of interesting work about this from George Frank. Managerialism, audit culture, electrification, internationalization, pursuing the global university. And this is what's really behind English medium instruction, I would suggest, and humanities in question. So we moved from the old days where Karl Marx would have gone to the British Library. Look at that, with pouring over these books, taking notes by hand in his illegible handwriting, to the modern day academic who I'm representing this way, right? So you have to see this, you can't, this is not really where it's at, this is where it's at. Okay, so internationalization, as I mentioned, is really a driving force here. There are lots of definitions you can find around, but most people sort of understand what they're talking about when they say internationalization. You have this idea of the dominant policy discourse, and it's presented as an ideological, mutual, coherent, disembodied, knowledge-driven policy and intervention. Right? Very often. Not always, but very often. This is an example from Spain, actually, from the Spanish Ministry of Education. And this is the so-called internationalization strategy. And of course, universities around the world have what's called an internationalization strategy. UCL will have one, the university I work at has one. And again, international strategy, the idea that it goes further than simply promoting student mobility and signing international agreements. There's all this other stuff that's going on. Right? I find this one particularly compelling, because I'm not, at first glance, I sort of, what is that? Right? But you have this circulation of brains. I'm interested. But again, if you look through this, if you look across different universities, you look across different education systems, you look across different higher education policies in different countries, you're going to find very, very similar terminology being used, and similar categorizations. Now, of course, there are critical responses, and this is somebody critiquing the document I was just referring to in Spain. And again, one point that's made that I think is very interesting is the great differences in lack of coordination that exist in general terms among different Spanish universities. Right? Now, this goes to the heart of one of the big problems that we'll see with English medium instruction, which is there a kind of a general readiness for internationalization as it's being understood by policymakers, and then more specifically, English medium instruction. Now, why is that there at the top? Anyway, can you see that at the top, internationalization? From internationalization, we move to Englishization, right? So there's this kind of cascade effect. We have, global capitalism impacting on notions of how we organize education. We have internationalization, then we move to Englishization, right? And Englishization, of course, the process whereby English becomes the language that mediates a wide range of higher education activities. And again, this is going on around the world. This is occurring on the back of a more general spread of English around the world as a general lingua franca, international language, whatever. But particularly in university, you're starting to see it. So it's not just about English medium instruction, it's about administration and all that. Very interesting to look at web pages. It's very often web pages. The ones I would work with, or I'm working, would be in Catalan and Spanish, bilingual, and then it'll have text in English. But what's found very often, and I was thinking about a study that Francesca Held was involved in a few years ago. I saw her give this talk at a conference, and it was interesting that in Italian, she was working in Italy. In fact, she works in Italy, and she was looking at Italian web pages, Italian university web pages, and very often you would have the text was different in English than it was from Italian. It might have been shorter, or it might even have different information. And I found this as well in some of the ones I've looked at least in the neck of the woods I'm in Catalonia. The university I used to work at sometimes would have a web page where it'd say, Catalan, Spanish, and English. And then you go to the English one and it was in Spanish. Kind of strange. So here we have this whole issue that Englishization is taking over different levels. Now, what we have here is that Englishization is bound up with practices of normalization and surveillance, right? To produce identities suited to the goal of international updates. I thought I'd put this in because, again, it's a way of problematizing internationalization, problematizing Englishization. What's actually going on when we do these things? So we're actually regulating people's behavior through the use of English. My battery's gone out. Anyway. Sorry. I'm not sure what's going on. Suddenly I can't advance. I did manage to go back.
The slides are okay. How about there? Can you use that now?
Okay.
Should I just stay here?
I don't know. Maybe so. Yeah, right. Okay. Right. Okay. So I've mentioned Englishization. We moved from Englishization, moving down further to English medium instruction. And again, here we have what is English medium instruction. Education system where content is taught through English in context where English is not used as the primary first official language. So this is and again, other definitions, teaching of academic content through English in classes that do not focus on language teaching themselves. So these are kind of two sides to the issue. One is simply the use of English, and the other one is there's not a language teaching and learning goal. And one of the things we found in this project, and one of the things we were interested in was the whole notion of whether somebody who's an engineer teaching classes in English ever acts as an English teacher. Now you might say, what does it mean to act as an English teacher? Well, doing anything that English teachers do. So, for example, explicit focus on form, for example. Right? That might be something. Or organizing vocabulary lists. That could even be an action. Or even translation. So we did and we didn't find evidence that this was going on. And when we did find evidence and put it to the lecturers, they tended to say, no, that's not English. I'm not an English language teacher. We have these kind of disciplinary boundaries, which I will come to in a moment. Now, different contexts that we could look at, and this is from an article by Baker and Hutner, so it's sort of helpful breakdown. We have what's called student mobility programs, which cater to students from a range of linguistic backgrounds, local and international. So that's the idea. University in Barcelona, you have students from all over the world. It's actually efficient to use English as a lingua franca. People just arrive there. They're not going to be able to do the classes in Catalan or Spanish, so they do the classes in English. Then there's internationalization at home, where you possibly have a local population. So in my case, I have bilingual Catalan and Spanish speakers. Everybody has that profile pretty much, and you still do the classes in English. So the idea is you're bringing internationalization in through Englicization, through English instruction. And then Anglophone context programs would be more like here in London. Now, the student mobility programs very often become internationalization at home. What I mean by that is, ostensibly, it's student mobility that's being addressed in the internationalization policy. We say, we have students, we have international students, so we need to teach the classes in English. But what happens when you offer a class and there are no students from outside the local context? You still do the class in English. So what starts out as a general policy that's more in the realm of student mobility, de facto becomes internationalization at home through the use of English. And it's kind of interesting how the only thing that makes it an international focus is the use of English. Now, this is a typical scenario. You could have 20 students all at home and all putative Catalan and Spanish bilinguals. One lecturer at home who's also a Catalan Spanish bilingual, teaching and assessment materials all in English, question mark. Probably, but not necessarily. Classroom language, always, also a question mark. We observe different policies on the part of individual lecturers. So one in particular was very interesting because she lectured pretty much in English, but sometimes she'd stop, and if she was unsure the students understood, she would do a sort of re-explain everything in Catalan. And she did that with it. And she, thinking possibly she had 2 or 3 students who would not have understood Catalan, but thinking they would have gotten it in English. So you, again, this is like so many other things, becomes very pragmatic, if you like, in application. When people on the spot decide different ways of doing things to get to the end. There's also what I would say the risk of pantomime in all this, though, because as I said, if you have all these students, in this context, for example, all the students are bilingual Catalan Spanish speakers and the professor is, why on earth are they doing a class in English? There is no communicative necessity to do class in English. So we have to fall back on its internationalization. But still, if you were an anthropologist from Mars, and you arrived at this situation, you'd say, okay, hold on a second. These people, they know these languages, they all know these languages, so why aren't they using them for the instruction? Why are they using this other third language? So it doesn't really make sense, and it does become an element of pantomime, sort of theater. Now, what we look at today is this individual who I'll call Begonia, not her real name, an agronomy engineer, 9 years experience, 3 of which in ME, and her English, as she reported, was C1 in 2016. We were not, demanding that people show us documentation about their level of English, and we also did not test them. The professors who participated in the study. We thought that would be a little bit too much, really. She was interviewed several times, but really 2 big interviews, one in September 2017 and one in October 2018. Her classes were observed regularly, so at least she had maybe 20 sessions during the course she was teaching, maybe 10 of them or more were observed. I'm seeing her, I'm pitching her here as a telling case, so one particular case, one individual that can tell us quite a bit about the phenomenon of focus. And she also is acting as an informed insider. So we asking her questions, she's telling us things that we couldn't possibly know that she would know. There are a couple of questions driving this. One is, what negative aspects are identified in an early career STEM lecture, which is her? And how is the lecture's perspective different from views on internationalization in India that one finds in more optimistic accounts that frame the teaching modality as a necessarily positive experience? So, just to say a couple of things about what we're going to look at is we're looking at what she So she's providing us accounts, as to say, and in some cases, what I found looking at the data, some of these could be qualified as narratives, looking at models such as Lavada and Valensky, where you have sort of a setting up of the story, a telling of the story, some kind of conflict arising, or some problem arising, resolution, and possibly a code at the end. Right? So a lot of what she said conformed to that kind of structure. And other things are just simply introducing thematic and explanatory information, telling us how it is. And sometimes, obviously, you get these genres being mixed. Other key elements in the accounts was framing, taken from the work of Goffman, so we're understanding what's going on, and very often she might shift the frame, if you like, during the course of conversation, which is, again, a very common phenomenon in ongoing interaction. This tends to link the immediate context with the broader context. So what she's talking about specifically with the broader context within the institution she's working in. And again, the immediate context is embedded in the socio-cultural, institutional, peak level social structures, what I mentioned earlier about the different shaping of structures. Narration comes through in all of this. This is kind of a framework for this. I also mentioned the data being presented will be using James Paul Gee's approach to the presentation of interview data, where he uses stanzas. So you sort of have lines appearing like this, which makes analysis much easier if you're doing content analysis. Okay? There's also an issue here, a cognitive issue, if you like. So the past events in her life, what we're really tapping into, hopefully, in our conversations, is her episodic memory, her memory of these kind of unique, concrete personal experiences that she's had in her life. And the elements of episodic memory kind of clustered together into what Holland and et al., Holland and three other authors have called this idea of socially constructed grounds of interpretation, if you like. And these are figured worlds, this idea of figured worlds, if you like. So we have the episodic memory contributing to the construction of kind of sort of aggregate figured worlds. Now, at the beginning of the first interview that we did with Begonia, she started talking about, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm going to, sort of suggesting she was going to be almost like a whistleblower and tell us things that we didn't know were going on behind the scenes in the institution that she worked in. So, again, this is a particularly interesting story that she tells. If you look at it, she's saying, well, she was working as a temporary lecturer, so she was in a much more precarious position than some of her colleagues in the department. She wasn't on anything like a tenure track position. And again, she said she was promised by the dean that if she became an English medium instruction lecturer, that she would be fast tracked for promotion. And then she explains that this didn't happen. And so she starts referring to what this person did as a filthy lie, right? They're going to promote the lectures he taught in English. And she actually kind of got a very interesting, says, I even have emails, and I can even, she was even suggesting I can prove what I'm saying, if you like. So again, she was quite, at this time, upset about this, that she had been betrayed in some way. She'd been led into doing it, and yet the payoff of getting the promotion did not come through. I'll come back to that because there was a slight twist as we went through our contacts with her. Now, this is a kind of two-part story, if you like, and this is where we start getting into what we might call the dark side. The dark side could be seen as her saying that the dean lied to her, but we'll leave that to the side. Another element of the dark side is how she actually feels about what she's doing, what kind of situation it puts her in. And here she starts off by talking about the way that she, very diligently prepares her classes, prepares what she's going to lecture about, but then finds that, as she says, my English level is crap, and she talks about her cortisol level going up and stress coming in. And interestingly mentions here that she doesn't have much experience, kind of goes to the more general, much experience in actually speaking English, although she's worked academically through English. And then she says at the end something interesting. You can know a class in English, and yes, you can regurgitate the content reading the PowerPoint, but that's not what it's about, right? So obviously this idea of the PowerPoint could be something to fall back on, where you might not have to talk and you can just have all the text there. That's not really what it's about. She also mentions in the same story here that she's comparing that she could teach the same exact class in Spanish, to a Spanish language version, and to an English language version. And that when she does it in Spanish, she feels more comfortable, obviously. Obviously. But then she shifts. I mean, she keeps going, and then she kind of gets this thing that really is serious. And so I'm telling you, it's like I'm shitting myself with fear, she says, and literally fear. And then she starts talking about getting stuck and stuttering. And then finally she says, well, after 5 years of teaching classes, it's like I've gone back to day one. It's like I've gone back to when I first started studying English. So this is quite emotive, if you like. And I was actually in this interview. There were two of us interviewing her. And I just remember sort of, how she was expressing these feelings she had about this, and that it was quite compelling. And again, she carried on in a similar sort of vein. Now, one of the things going on here, as I mentioned, she did mention that she could teach the same subject in the same class in Spanish, and the result was quite different. And what comes out of this is kind of a notion of disciplinary identity. This is from Ken Hyland's book from 2012, which I highly recommend, about disciplinary discourses, but it's a book about identity as well. And he talks about this idea of the sense of being a part of a discipline and all the important interactions, the common rhetorical locale, group identification, all these things come together in this kind of notion of a disciplinary identity. And of course, this is developed in her case, working in her case through Spanish. But then she finds herself having to exercise a profession in English. Now, one thing I came across a few years ago, which I found interesting, it's actually before I worked on this project, is the notion of role identity. This is not something I'm normally that particularly interested in. This is more in the realm of social psychology, and some of the work is interesting to me and some of it isn't. But I did find this interesting, this kind of idea of a social position a person holds in a larger social structure. I found that very interesting. And that, again, going back to what Ken Hyland was saying about this idea of disciplinary identity, that there's sort of developing a sense of who you are through your interactions with other people doing the same sorts of things. And Ken also talks about communities of practice as a framework, and that would be a familiar concept for a lot of people. One of the things that comes up in my mind is the idea of role diminishment. That here she is, as I said, she develops this kind of notion, this persona, this sense of self as a lecturer, a competent lecturer in Spanish in her particular specialty area, and yet she's feeling diminishment. She made us feel less important as part of the process, and sort of status reduction and a kind of redefinition of who she is. And we'll see that, we've seen that already. She's mentioned a few issues along those lines, and this will come out in a couple of the other excerpts we'll look at. So she sums up the problem with English. What makes all of this very difficult is English. Is when you are not proficient and you have C2 or C1 level, then you concentrate on the content and make it very fun or make it whatever. So again, there it is. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but she talks about using Spanish and how this makes things easier. The only thing she points out here, which is interesting, is that she could be lecturing in English and she could break away and tell a story in Spanish, but then she has to translate for the Erasmus students. So it kind of turns everything around with regard to what would be expected in any classroom. Now, one issue that came up when she was talking about herself, about stuttering, about getting stuck, and not being able to function in English, was what was her discourse like when she was actually in lecturing mode. Right? So I just put this up. This is a transcription of a section of one of the lessons, one of her classes. And if you read through this, at least the words on the page, you have a lot of technical vocabulary. And I would say it looks relatively coherent. Right? So what's left out of this to some extent is what it sounded, well, to completely left out of this is what it sounded, which is perhaps another issue. But there's something there. I mean, that she does have a command of English in principle. Right? It's just whether in delivering this, how she comes across, and again, how she sounds, that's the other issue. And she's very self-conscious about this. Now, one of the things that comes up in these cases is student evaluations. And here she felt like she was being pulled in two directions. So on the one hand, you had students who very often were students like Erasmus students who were coming in, And the idea is they're coming with a higher level of English and more confident in English and more demanding with regard to the English of the instructions. Right? And then on the other hand, she has the students she has who are local, who maybe are having trouble following her, not because her English is bad, but because they don't understand English very well. Right? And so again, this becomes a problem. She's stuck in the middle. It's kind of interesting that she ends this by saying, you know, she quotes these students, "I'm not able to follow this content because it's very complex. So what do I do?" Right? Asking us. So moving on, I'm just running through these, but I need to get going. The idea of another element she talks about is the kind of general regime she's working on. And at the beginning, I was talking about going back to the notion of the toxic university and all the pressures there are on lectures. She would be subject to all kinds of pressures anyway, even if she didn't do English medium instruction. So what comes through this is that the English medium instruction is on top of all the other pressures that she has. And she's certainly internalizing it, that judging by what she's saying. But she talks about the system. I thought was quite interesting. The system asks a lot of things of you, and some of them aren't rational. But you say okay, and you go along, but you're just barely getting by. And she starts talking about how she feels at the end of the day, dragging herself around. And so there are times that today I'm not going to sleep, I'll just go directly into a coma. Right? And I just can't, you know, it's almost like I can't go on, and yet she does. So. Now, one way to look at this, and we could go to Foucault's work, which I found very useful, the notion of the gaze, if you like. So what we end up here with is a notion of kind of an English medium education or English medium instruction gaze. That again, you have, for the future, we need to evolve. No, sorry, this is what I produced at the beginning, sorry. But what I produced at the beginning, I just sorry, let me go back, rewind. The quote I produced at the beginning is sort of restructured here. But what you get is what he's actually talking about could be seen as a gauge put on lectures like Begonia, if you like. And it's the whole idea of kind of categorizing and shaping others according to dominant discourses of normativity. And the new normativity is being an English medium instructor or being a completely Englishized academic. This is also involved publishing in English. Another issue that comes out of this, which is quite interesting, was this, and this occurred in the middle, towards the end, if I remember correctly, of the last interview with her. So this was well after we've been observing the classes, the end of an academic year, and on reflection, you know, what she said in the first interview, what she said in ongoing contacts with her, and also what she had done in her teaching. And she comes up with this idea that she realizes she's looking for recognition. Right? You know, why do I teach classes in English if it's so painful for me, right? Because I'm looking for recognition. And has it really brought me anything? It's made my life more complicated because I'm not really good enough in English to be doing this. So why do I do that? Because I was looking for recognition from the system. Has it granted me it? And then she turns around and says, well, actually, in the end, I've learned to do it. I'm happy, I'm satisfied. So when I wasn't in this interview, but when I looked at the transcription, I was quite taken aback by this, given what I witnessed in the first interview and also reading through the second interview and everything that she talked about. Kind of sense of anguish going on. So what was going on? Well, first of all, what's going on here is she's talking about this notion, if you like, coming from Wendy Brown, this kind of normativity constructing, calling people as entrepreneurial actors. And this is back to what we were saying about Foucault, if you like. In fact, Wendy Brown's work is based very strongly on Foucault, and this idea of self-care. So again, this idea of seeking recognition is she's kind of conforming to the normativity that's dominant. But more to the point is something I mentioned at the beginning, which is the George Frank's notion of the economy of attention. This is very interesting work because Frank has talked about society in general. This kind of attention economy, you can see it in all the social media, for example. But he's focused specifically on academia. And he describes scientists as entrepreneurs who allocate time and effort so as to maximize the attention received from other scientists. And attention comes to be recognition and notoriety. And how scientists seek the benevolent notice other people take of us. The attention of others is most irresistible to drugs, and to receive it outshines receiving any other kind of income. I thought it was interesting to sort of apply what she was talking about in recognition. You know, so why does she go through all these sacrifices? Why is it so unpleasant for her? But recognition becomes a big deal. Right? Interesting to think about. But one of the things that's more interesting is something that's not in any of the quotes or anything I've said so far. I mentioned at the beginning she was very unhappy because she felt like she'd been pulled into English medium instruction with the promise of promotion, which she then was not granted. Well, during the course of this academic year, between the time we interviewed her initially and she did a teaching that we observed and the final interview, lo and behold, she was granted for promotion. And so you have to wonder to what extent this could have something to do with that, right? That again, maybe it wasn't so bad. I now have my promotion, right? I would celebrate the fact she got a promotion, but it's kind of interesting this kind of turnaround at the end after telling us everything she told us, suddenly looking at it in a positive light. And also, there's a suggestion kind of a transactional approach to this. I'm doing this for the recognition and for promotion. So, conclusion, just to go through a few things. The first question we had about negative aspects of ME experiences identified by early career STEM lecture. She talks about the purported dishonest practices by those administering the unfulfilled promise of promotion. But again, I put a asterisk here, which is that she did get the promotion in the end, right? The insecurities about her English, now teaching English can be a traumatic experience for her. Reportedly unfair student evaluations when it always will be impossible to satisfy all the students, the extreme, often irrational demands of the system, like all ME lectures, and is there an ME gaze at work here? That's sort of a normativity imposed on them. The bodily toll that these demands exact on her, which she mentioned was higher all the time, and her need for recognition from the system that she believes to be inherently unfair. How is her perspective different from the views found in most optimistic accounts? Well, obviously, she recounts episodes negatively impacting her sense of self, as opposed to singing the virtues of internationalization. The only positive comment was the one I showed at the very end. Well, maybe it wasn't so bad. Now, other more general dark side issues, and this could open up a discussion because this is not just relevant to what I've been talking about, but more generally about English medium instruction. One is ME is variegated and non-unitary in the same way that global capitalism obviously is not the same everywhere. Well, we can also say that English medium instruction is going to be very different in different contexts. That's pretty obvious. Englishization equals an added workload for auxiliary staff. And this is another angle of Englishization, not looking at the lectures, but looking at administrators. Because often what happens is you have administrators who are used to functioning in whatever language they speak normally in a community. In the case I'm talking about here, I keep going back to Catalonia Spanish bilingualism. And then suddenly they said, well, we've got a lot of international students, you got to do this in English. And it's almost like, well, you just need to be able to do it in English. I've seen all kinds of sort of problems with this, with people in an office, 4 people in an office, 3 of them avoid the international students, and it all falls on one person who seems to be the best English speaker. These are things that are not really contemplated very often. They should be, and they probably are in some context, but this has to do with planning. You just suddenly we're going to do everything in English. Obviously, you need to take this sort of thing. Seems like an obvious point. The other thing is our lecture is up to the task. This is often comes up. It comes up in student evaluations, as Catalonia mentioned. But of equal importance are the students. And this is something that maybe doesn't come up as much. But the issues that I've been looking at with my colleagues who are looking in this particular study and others is that the students very often, what is their level of English? In the sort of European CEFL terms, they're looking at students who have either B1 level of English, expected to process complex material in English. They're being lectured in English, they're reading in English. And I sort of wonder about that myself. Also, there's a notion, despite the fact that ME is not about teaching English, that by osmosis, that by doing these things, these students will up their level of English. So you'll have, for example, the notion that at the end of their BSc or their BA or whatever they're studying, they will be expected to attain very often just a B2 level. That's not very high, I would say, in my view. But again, they're expected to improve their English to a certain level in order to graduate in some cases. That's actually not completely applied, but that's an idea that many people have. Should be students should have to reach a certain level of English. And the idea is that they're learning English just by doing. I will mention that one thing that we observed in the project is you could sit in a class with a lecture is taking place for 20 sessions, everything is done in English through the professor. And one individual student does not have utter one word of English during the entire course. Now you could argue because it's mostly in lecture mode, that there's a lot of group work, but the group work is with other students. And the other students are Catalan Spanish speakers, and so there's, and you don't have what do English teachers do then? They speak English, speak English. You don't do that. If you're any instructor, you just, well, that's not your job to impose English on them. So again, you have these kind of spin-off situations going on all the time that mitigate against a sort of successful application of English medium instruction. Internationalization and domain laws. A lot of people don't like the notion of domain laws. It seems to me almost commonsensical that domain laws exist. That if we move worldwide in context around the world into English medium instruction and indeed to Englishization of more and more parts of our lives, that local languages will suffer domain laws. And if I can anthropomorphize, I need to say the word, languages, if you like, but the idea they will lose, if you like. And this is a notion Robert Phillipson and Tony Scott-McCangus have been talking about for 30 years, and I think there is something here. Right? And I know people who tell me, well, it's not quite like that, but I can't see it any other way. And it's kind of interesting in the context I'm in, because in the bilingualism, very complex bilingualism between Catalan and Spanish, for a long time, the idea was that you wanted to up the number of PhD theses being written in Catalan as opposed to Spanish. Well, suddenly English appears, and the number of theses being written in Catalan and Spanish is going down, and the amount in English is going up. So the whole dynamics, if you like, are being turned on their head by the fact that English is in the equation. And of course, this is being done voluntarily. I mean, universities are opting into this. But it does raise the issue of what happens to languages if they're not used for PhD theses, if they're not used for research. Yeah, we could discuss this. Language identity, who am I in different languages, comes up. Very, very good expression you can find in Catalan and in Spanish, this idea of tenir taules or tener tablas, is the idea of you've got resources, right? And I think one of the key things that Begonia is talking about, and this came up in other conversations, is what do you do when things go wrong? Do you have the wherewithal in English to make a joke or to get through a situation, or do you just get nervous? And again, this is something I'm very interested in. I'm also interested in the notion of all of this because I myself, I have lectured in Catalan and in Spanish. And I might think in my day-to-day communication in those languages, I don't have any problems communicating. So I'm perfectly proficient, I suppose. But this is a different kettle of fish. You're standing in front of people and you're dealing with concepts that are quite complex. And if you're not that practiced in it, that's the key, then it's actually quite different. And I think a lot of people around the world who've only ever dealt with one language, and very often it might be English, have never been in a situation where they've had to do this sort of thing. It's difficult to understand. But it is that. It's like that tape recorder in the back of your head saying, what did you just say? And not only that, it's not a face-to-face conversation, it's in front of people. So again, there's all kinds of things can go wrong. Do you have the kind of wherewithal to get through them? In this case, in English. Right? Institutional support is often lacking. That's not a surprise. Are there any kind of like help groups? Are professors encouraged to organize groups? We try to do this through the project to suggest the idea that in the future, people could meet in one department and talk about some of their experiences or something like that. The whole thing of like for like, this is a very sensitive issue. Whether the L1 instruction and English instruction, are they the same? Is the same content being covered with the same effectiveness, if you like? And this is an empirical question. I mean, you could explore this through examination. But anecdotal evidence would suggest no, and I think a lot of the professors themselves are saying, if I teach this particular class in English, I do less material during the course of 20 sessions. So what is it a replica of? Right? Is it meant in the case of the professors working in their own language and working in English, is it meant to be a replica? sort of, that they are replicated, if you like, exactly 100%. Again, this ties in with the previous one, but again, this is an open question. And of course, as I said, it can become pantomime, which is probably not the worst thing that can happen, but it's not a good thing. My short career at ME, I sort of came into this field, as I said, somewhat by accident, sort of got into it. I've had a few publications coming out. As of now, sort of, I guess I may be moving away again. But anyway, thank you for listening to me. And hopefully I've offered a little bit of food for thought, and we can maybe talk about a few things now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that very stimulating talk, and apologies for the technical hitches that we had along the way, but thanks to Nathan for being here and sorting them all out. We didn't do it intentionally, David, but okay, so what we've got now, we've got about half an hour for some discussion or some questions. Has anybody got a question or a comment that they would like to make to David now, while I have a look and see if there's anything in the chat room?
Are you sharing?
Yes. Okay. Yes. You.
Earlier on, you rejected the term neoliberalism for another term. I was just curious why you rejected it. What you didn't like about it?
Because everybody's using it. I mean, that's a glib answer. I've used it a lot in my own work, mainly because there's a tendency around it for people to think somehow that we're living in times that are so unique. And I've had a lot of conversations with John about these things, and John recently was at an online seminar talking about this. Using the idea of global capitalism as a base, this has existed for some time. And in fact, Marx and Engels talk about what essentially is global capitalism in the colonial era. So a lot of things that people see happening today have happened before, have been going on for a long time. Things like exploitation. So some of the characteristics of capitalism, exploitation, alienation, all these things, these have always been around in capitalist systems. And a lot of the current research going on very often, you listen to scholars talking about it, is if this didn't happen before. They don't say this didn't happen before, but it's sort of left up in the air that somehow we're living in times that are just totally different. People talk about the new economy and this sort of thing. But technology is always driven economy. It's always mediated and driven economic development and social and cultural development. That was thus 2 centuries ago, and it's that case today. So if people think today, oh, we have the infosphere and all this, and it's never, we never had technology so important, it's always been important. So it's kind of the thing that it's the same old, right? Not to say that there aren't unique features in this today, but there were unique features of what we know in the past. Right? So that basically that. So I don't think that acronym is ever going to take hold or anything. But it's just in wording, like whatever I might say the current form of global capitalism, which is global capitalism, as opposed to second neoliberalism. I don't know how important it really is to do that. It's just people, when you say neoliberalism, seem to know something about what they're talking about. But as I said, I mean, if people sort of want to present this as something so unique, today's time is so unique and different from others, it seems a bit naive actually to see things in that way.
The reason I asked this, I was wondering if you think that's the main thing that's driving EMI. It's because we have this kind of new environment, or is it maybe something inevitable because of global capitalism, or if we had a different system, different economic or political system, would actually that not be happening? Or
well, that's actually a very good point, because if you look at timelines, and if you look at what people generally identify, I mean, the seeds of what's known as neoliberalism go back a century ago. You have Hayek, you have on Nice, Popper, you have all, this, and then you have the Chicago School later in the United States. The culmination really is in Pinochet in Chile in the 1970s, first experiment, and then you have that famously Reagan, Thatcher, and then the social democratic parties being sucked into the 1980s. And again, so it's really something, when people think about neoliberalism, it's something from the late 1970s that looking at that period. What's happening with the spread of English? Spread of English started well before that. If you look at accounts of spread of English. So you could argue that we're obviously never working just on one track. There's all these things, these developments going on in parallel, and they're constantly intersecting. And so the notion, you know, the idea of English as an international language, for example, to use one term, has existed for some time. And we could argue it pre-existed what we understand as the neoliberal age. So this was going on, and it's just the confluence, if you like. But there were always kind of economic reasons. If you went back to the 60s, there would have been people talking about learning English for business, for example. So, but they wouldn't have, you would argue that in the 1960s, they weren't living in what's known as the neoliberal era, if you like. Although they were living under global capitalism. So going back to what I said earlier. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but
oh yeah,
just a couple of comments from the chat. Margub, Resmi, and Alexandra all thank you, David, for a very stimulating talk. I would ask a question about the context that you were reporting on. He says, what level of language proficiency is normally required of EMI lecturers in this particular educational context?
I would say it's more willingness and self-evaluation. So I would imagine if somebody said, I don't speak English at all, I'm not going to volunteer, or semi-volunteer for this program. But the people involved, they ranged in their enthusiasm about it. But I can think of one person in particular who was just completely in line with it. I think she was very competent in English and very confident about it. She loved it. She loved teaching English. It's interesting, you mentioned being early career. A lot of these people were early career academics, and whether they mentioned promotion or mentioned anything, they were kind of with the program. You know, we need to do things in English, and I'm willing to participate in that because I see it as part of my own development. You know, so apart from going to conferences, I'm going to teach English. But the question was not that.
Was about the level of proficiency that was required.
To the level we came across, I mean, the level we were able to sort of attach, if you like, to the different lecturers participating with what they told us. And like I said, we didn't want to, it would have been politically and even sort of interpersonally difficult to, what we're going to do, we're going to test you and really watch, get the results independently of whatever you, we want to have independent proof that you have this level or that level. It was enough. We also were dealing with what was, I mean, they already were teaching English, but it didn't seem to be a direct control there. It was like some people maybe had tested at C1 or C2, right? But maybe others haven't. But they've just been doing it. They've been using English in conferences, and they kind of thought, well, I could teach. And then after 3 or 4 years, they felt they would get better at teaching English. The students, on the other hand, had no entry level. And that was very problematic. And as I said, observing classes in this sort of context, the impression you get is, first of all, you could sit through, you could avoid ever having to use English. A lot of these classes used a format where they had whole presentations at the end, but they might be done in groups. So it might be the person who had to speak for 2 minutes, and they might have a text and read it in some cases. So there just wasn't, there was interaction, but again, as I said, if students are working in groups, they're not going to speak English. They don't normally speak English to each other. Why would they speak in English to do a task? So again, that's where the eliminating the English language teaching and learning element, which is kind of a definitional part of it, comes into the equation. And these disciplinary identities of the professors, I don't do English language teaching. Basically, we were being told that I am not an English language teacher. I don't know how to do that. I can't do that.
Okay. I've got some more questions here, but there might be another one from the floor. John.
Yeah, David, thanks very much. I found that really interesting, and of course it echoed much of my thinking. And when I think of internationalization and EMI, the thing that really troubles me about it is this deep-seated belief that EMI or internationalization equates with development. This idea that development is going to occur. Now, I've always felt this is a highly questionable notion, which is never really properly investigated, or at least there are language economists who look at this and they question this idea that there is, a real connection between development in English amongst the population and economic development. And then in relation to that, sort of connect to that thought, what you said about domain loss, I totally am with you completely on that, because I think that is most certainly occurring. And you very interestingly placed on your slide, you know, are the teachers up to it? And what about the students? And I was just interested in your views on what I'm concerned from my perspective about what I might call, say, cumulative technical illiteracy by the delivery of academic subject matter in a language which is only most of the students do not share, because it's English, it's not. It's not. So there's this kind of, for me, this idea that because they're not because of the domain loss, the expertise is being degraded in some way within that particular language. I was interested in your view.
No, I think that's an interesting point. I would agree with that. Going back to the previous thing you said about development, depending on how we understand development, if we understand development in sort of very broad sense, so the theories of development, or that there are countries that are more developed than other countries in terms of economics. I see this as, it might sound, I don't know if this is sleight of hand, but not so much a push from the wanting development, it's wanting participation, not to be left behind, because we're looking, after all, at European countries here. You know, we're looking at a high standard of living already, but the notion that you want to maintain that even, you're going to have to play, you're going to have to be part of this global, you have to develop global citizens, you're developing global citizens, right? And that through university studies and that sort of thing. So it's almost like we just have to do it because everybody else is doing it. We're being kind of pulled along by this. So yeah, but I suppose you could argue that depending on how you define development, that's also on development. But yeah, I understand. I think the idea of internationalization is going to lead to, it's like so many other kind of rules of thumb that are out there that just don't really seem to work, but yet everybody thinks they work.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, let's see. I've got a question here from Marcello. He says, David, first of all, thanks for the talk. David mentions the lack of institutional support. Can he elaborate on what would consist adequate, or what adequate institutional support would consist of? Will it be language professionals working with disciplined teachers and providing support and assisting developing courses?
Well, it would, and I should point out that it's not like I don't want to leave this particular institution in a bad light. My point would be that I think what we observe going on in this particular university goes on in lots of universities. So that's one thing I'd like to point out. The other thing is that it's not like there's no support, and the notion, in fact, one of the main members of the research team has in the past, in fact, knew some of the people participating because he had taught them English classes, which were directed at teaching entities. So that there was support in that regard. But on the other hand, there's that. The university doesn't organize that. There's no coming together. Some of these people worked side by side in departments. They knew each other, but there was never any kind of push or incentive for them to meet and talk about specifically the practice of ending. And we came to the conclusion that would be quite helpful, because we were pointing out, we would look at, for example, the rubrics they use to evaluate their students when they do oral presentations. We were kind of feeding back to them things we were observing, and they found that very interesting. And sometimes they'd say, I hadn't thought about that. But we also said it would be a good idea if you guys got together and managed. Of course, this is extra work, maybe it could be seen as extra work. So the idea would be, what would be some incentive offered for them to actually meet and sort of exchange experiences and maybe work with themselves. They wouldn't need one of us. They wouldn't need an academic or an English teacher to do that for them. They could do it themselves, and that might be more useful. It sounds almost like a self-help group, but something. It's not some kind of support like that. But the support, they can do it themselves, but they would need to be nudged or pushed in that direction. And one of the ways of doing that would be to incentivize that. Obviously the English classes, that would be an example of support. I've just mentioned that, and I suppose going to external seminars and that sort of thing. But I don't want to get into too much of that because that's a very technical approach. Like you go to a seminar and learn how to do things and then you apply it. But certainly, anything that would mediate their practice beyond what's going on, where they seem to be working sort of as individuals, doing this, facing everything they do alone. Even though I don't doubt that maybe over lunch or something, somebody might mention something, or maybe they wouldn't. I don't know if necessarily if they know each other well, there's really the kind of trust where they might share negative experiences of the sort that maybe they might share with research. So I mean, it's really just starting out with an idea that it needs to be better organized. I mean, not just the help and the lectures participating, but maybe better planning all the way around. And also thinking more about who's involved in this. And one thing that's quite interesting was as there were early career academics, a lot of the senior academics, and might have been closer to retirement, in many cases refused to do this. And they were able to do that because there wasn't any question they could be fired. And so when it was put to them, why don't you, teach in English? They might say, I'm not going to do that. I've never done that in 35 years. Why should I do it now? So there also is a generational thing going on here, which is kind of interesting. And then the power structures within departments that you see in experienced academics. And in some cases, ultra tenured academics don't have to do this.
If it's all right, I'll just ask another question from the chat because I missed it earlier on. It's from Anna Christina Hogren, who thanks you, David, for a super talk. And her question is more at the sort of the macro level. And she says, if you were to take a more macro level perspective on EMI, what would you say are the most important drivers of English as a medium of instruction?
Well, as I said earlier, we could go back, and I would recommend everybody read John O'Regan's recent book to look at sort of the world English perspective. Where did this whole thing? And you can go back to earlier works 30 years ago by Alistair Finney Cook and Phillipson. Where did this all start? This whole spread of English and how it's always been linked to economics, if you like, and political economy, if you like. So not just economics is technical, but sort of political, social, and everything else going on. So that would be the approach. I don't know if I need to say something concrete or.
No, that sounds all right. Yeah, it was just a more macro perspective on what you thought the drivers were.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have. I'd say go to John's book because I'm trying to think of very specific examples. I don't know if John wants the same thing, but I think, they're historically they're. I suppose you go back to certain events and developments that you go through that could be technological. The colonization is obviously in there, and all of these are macro level events. And John draws a lot on Wallerstein's world systems theory, and you have this idea of epochal. You have this idea of shorter time and longer time, and so you have long-term trends, and then you have shorter-term trends that might come down to specific events. And all of these would be shaping the ongoing, march of humanity, if you like, and development of societies. And again, in this is, at some point, this spread of English occurs, if you like. And again, I would make the point I said earlier, I mean, this is going on before what people understood neoliberalism to view, but it was always driven by political economic issues.
Well, I think that's the point that comes from out of your book, John. I mean, I don't know if you want to nuance what David's just said or add to that in any way.
I totally agree with David, of course. I'd add from what he's just said that when Christina asked that question about what are the driving forces, I mean, clearly it's from a world systems perspective, we live in a capitalist world system. We are currently in a capitalist world system which is dominated by a particular hegemonic power. That hegemonic power is the United States, which is the lead power of a world economy. So it's a world economy led by the United States. And to be the hegemon of a world economy, you need to have dominance in certain areas of structural power. And one of the areas of structural power is what's known as the knowledge structure. And you can have great advantage in the knowledge structure if the language that is your favorite language is the hegemonic language of the system. And in this case, it is the hegemonic language of the system. And this gives the United States and all nations Anglophone nations what I refer to in the book as linguistic seigniorage in the system, particularly the United States. This notion of linguistic seigniorage I take from currency seigniorage, because the dollar has currency seigniorage in our current system. And so what David points to in terms of kind of the structures, the driving motors of this situation, I think is spot on. And the only other thing I would add is that it's all informed by a particular kind of developmentalist discourse, which comes out of what some people refer to as the philosophical discourse of modernity, this idea that we're all moving forward. So I would see those are kind of macro things that are going on in this respect.
There are some more questions in the chat, but somebody else in the room might want to make a comment or ask a question.
Yeah, I did have another one. So I think you did a very good job outlining all these sort of negative, sides to it. I'm wondering, are there any sort of obvious solutions? As in, would you go as far to say we should be rolling it back, or is there a best practice framework that could be developed, or some kind of obvious solution?
Yeah, I mean, I would not just specifically. I'll give you my personal view, and it's somewhat interesting. Like if I go around the world to use English to give talks like this one. I am here in London now, so maybe it's not, but I have given talks in English in Spain, for example, and obviously other countries around the world. But I do feel like I would say that the whole idea that everybody has to speak English, that everybody has to know English, is kind of a fundamental idea that's driving education systems around the world as we speak. Right? The resources are generally not provided for that to happen, by the way, but there's a lot of rhetoric around this. I somehow disagree with that, that everybody has to know English. Some people that maybe do need to know English since it has been established as a lingua franca, but does everybody really have to know English? It's impossible to have a fulfilling life anywhere in the world if you don't know English. Right? So at that higher level, any is just a part of it. But I just wonder if the idea is that you want engineers, right, to come out of their degree programs and to be able to work in English. So like you go to work for a company where English is a lingua franca because they're communicating with, they're in Barcelona, but they're communicating with people in Switzerland and other countries, and English is used in lingua franca, which is a very common scenario. Are there not other ways that person could learn English? Do they have to learn English through their studies? There seems to be some sort of assumption it has to happen that way. Or that in absence of maybe instruction or intensive instruction, it might make them advance remarkably in 1 year, or to go abroad, whatever the case. They just have to do, over the course of 3 or 4 years of study, as many subjects as possible in English, and that voila, they will come out of this as fully functioning English speakers. As I said, in a lot of contexts I know of, it's just not working, really. And so, but the bigger issue, as I said, is that do we all think really that we really want English to be in everything, to dominate all the domains of our lives, if you like, around the world. And then go back to domain laws, and what happens? What does that say about sort of kind of linguistic ecologies around the world, if you like? And so I've come to the conclusion that I contributed to this, as an English language teacher for many years, and I continue to contribute to some extent by going into international conferences. If I go to Japan, I speak in English. I'm contributing to that. But I deep down, I just don't think it's right. It's just there has to be another way. Why? But some people said to me, well, if you say that, you're just cutting off. You're cutting off the prospect of people communicating with each other. Right? So I don't want to get into that. But it just at a sort of fundamental level, this notion that everybody has to know English, and that by doing that, you're going to be excluding other languages, which is what's going on. But I mean, what John was talking about, one time French had a particular status in the world, and it's just been sort of pushed to the side. And so, what kind of world do we want to live in with regard to that? But these things are so complex and so multi-tentacled and everything. No one single act is going to do much, if you like. Or me saying what I just said doesn't possibly make much difference, or was seen as a contradiction in itself. But if you ask me, I would say I'm not sure that's best of all possible worlds in the future, everybody's speaking English.
So it's sort of inevitable in a way.
Yeah. Well, hold on. I mean, the only thing I would say is watch this space. Because John mentioned the US is still, you know, the big player, if you like, in the economy. But China, removing COVID from the equation, I would argue China's economy is bigger than the US economy. So the number one economy in the world is China. And what will happen in the future if China does what other empires have done in the past, which is say, you're going to speak my language? I'm oversimplifying, but for the moment, there hasn't been that. The English has been used as a lingua franca also by Chinese multinational companies and that sort of thing. But what would happen if the same as it's happened with English, they said, well, you know, you're going to have to learn Mandarin. Already in countries like Japan, the number of people studying Mandarin has increased exponentially, and indeed, I would imagine in South Korea and other countries. And so this is something to think about. This could change. This could change in our life, in my lifetime, not. Okay, but in your lifetime, I don't know. But you know, we could see a sudden, not sudden change, maybe, but some change with time. And it would be clear what was going on. I think it could change something.
Okay, I've got a question here from Francesca Helm. Francesca thanks you, David, for a really interesting talk. She asks if you know if there's been an increase in international students in Spain or Catalonia as a result of more EMI provision. Do universities in Spain charge international students more than domestic students as the UK does?
Yes, but it's not as much of a money maker. Should know that actually. The university I work at present is very internationalized, if you like, in terms of academic staff, people coming in and out, postdocs, people coming in for post 5 years or whatever, and the student body as well. So increased. Spain has increased the number of international students over the past 30 years a lot. I mean, I don't have the numbers, but that has gone up a lot. Would it reach a level where it plateaued? I don't know. And again, this is I'm including this Erasmus. You have students live 6 months for 1 year. I did a BA level course. I taught a BA level course in the autumn last year, and I had a British student who was doing his entire BA because the tuition fees are much lower than Britain. That's the other thing. If you're British and you go to the university I work at, you will pay less in tuition fees over 3 years. And so if you calculate the cost of living and everything else, and that's what he did. He started off thinking he could be there a year and then just stayed with his degree. And then I have an American student who was doing the same thing. So I think we're starting having these economies, you know, people start calculating these things. You say, well, if it's a good, you know, it's a good enough university and the programs is offered entirely in English, well then, you know, so maybe that's how IME starts working and having a purpose, if you like. But yeah, you know, that could be a way of increasing the number of international students if people start seeing that. I mean, this is something that's going on in countries like the Netherlands, Maastricht, I remember a long time ago offering everything in English or a lot of programs in English. And they were British students still, and this was like 25 years ago. So again, that there could be an economic issue that leads to more international students coming, and not just the kind of intercultural motivation.
I think we've got time for probably one more question. Is there one from the floor? There's definitely another one in the chat room, but if anybody wants to grab the opportunity now to ask a question, make a comment. Okay, this is from Tolera then, who's one of Jim's students, I think. David, he says in the introduction section to your book, you state that countries in Northern Europe adopted EMI much later as compared to the Southern nations.
No.
Is there evidence that suggests
No,
that?
No, the opposite.
Okay. You state, okay. But the question is there evidence that suggests that Northern nations have gained economic advantage over the Southern because of their adopting EMI?
That's a very good question. You could argue they were already, you could turn it around and say they were already economically advanced And that could have something to do with English already, or because this goes back a long ways. It's got an idea of the Nordic countries, for example, if you're looking at 3 or 4 countries in particular. I don't know. That's a very good, but it is a very good question. I don't have sort of, I haven't read an article where it break it down empirically, you can see this, but would it surprise me? No, but also those countries have advanced for lots of other reasons. So a country like Finland, which of the Nordic countries is relatively poor, a few decades ago, has become one of the wealthiest countries in the world, not because of English, but because of Nokia and because of just technological advances. So at least that's my reading of it. So, obviously it's never going to be just English, and I know the person's not saying that, but whether, I don't know, the added, having English extensively, English medium instruction in universities, and getting to the point where such a high percentage of PhD theses are done in English, as is the case in countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland, does that lead them to become even more rich? It certainly maybe keeps them in the advantageous position they're in already in terms of per capita income and that sort of thing, but I don't know, how much. That's an economics of language issue. So people who study economics of language, that's the kind of thing we would be looking at. And it's, there could be research out there, I just don't know about it. But, I suspect it might.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David, for that talk. Thank you all for coming along, and thanks to everybody who followed it on the live streaming. People are saying thank you, David. They really enjoyed it. And it will be available. It's been recorded, so it will be available to you if you want to access it afterwards. I realize that there are 1 or 2 people who asked questions that I haven't been able to relate to David, but I'm sure, David, you'll be happy to receive emails.
They can send me an email.
Yeah, and I'm sure David will be happy to engage in conversation with you. Okay, so thanks everybody, and a big round of applause for David.
I